This lecture will cover the 14th century in Italy, what the Italians refer to as the Trecento, 300, literally, or the 1300s, as we would understand it. In this century, we're going to see a movement towards the Renaissance, as the precursors to the Renaissance, in Cimabue and Giotto specifically, are going to revive an interest in naturalism and create rhetorical gestures for narratives that allow us to understand our world as it appears. In addition, we're going to see that after this generation, the Black Death will cause a regression or retreat from this naturalistic approach. Now, before moving on with the precursors to the Renaissance, we need to realize that much of the work that is to follow brings together the various strands of the traditions from the later Middle Ages that we were discussing in Survey 1. That being the International Gothic style from France, as seen on the left here with the Visitation at Reims, with the elegant, courtly, S-shaped serpentine sweeping figures that are slightly elongated. To that in Germany, with the naturalistic approach to psychological realism, using real figures, polychroming or using many colors to make the figures look as realistic as possible, anecdotally observed details whereby the man pulls up the strap on his shield, and once again Uta, in this instance, pulls her cloak over her face because she is cold. All very carefully observed. We also discussed how the revival in the later Middle Ages included looking to late antique sculpture, such as the sarcophagi found in the Camposanto in Pisa. Here we find Nicola Pisano drawing inspiration for his Pisa pulpit with large, bulky, weighty figures in traditional Greco-Roman attire. In this case, of course, the Annunciation, Nativity, and Adoration to the Shepherds. This interest in volumetric shapes and spatial organization will be very important for the artist to come. And finally, we talked about a very important movement, and that's going to be that of the Byzantine style, or the Maniera Greca, making its way to Western Europe after the sack of Constantinople in 1204 with the Fourth Crusade. Here we find the style of carefully incised outlines, building on a prototype or copying the same image over and over ad nauseum because of the power it contains, will then influence the work in Italy specifically to adopt these specific approaches to art in their crucifixes and in many of their emotionally charged crucifixion scenes. Now, all of this comes together in Florence, the cradle of the Renaissance, where we're going to have a number of important characters working to revive the Greco-Roman tradition, including Dante writing his Divine Comedy, including the most famous example, the Inferno, Petrarch writing his Canzone, and both of them celebrating the loves lost of Beatrice and Laura, respectively, and Boccaccio, who's going to be writing the Decameron after the Black Death, at the same time as Chaucer, both of them recording the anecdotal stories of secular subjects and what happened at the time. It's not surprising that all of this occurs as we find a decline in feudalism. That being, feudalism is where you have land-owning nobles, right, who control and own an area and its agricultural production, and serfs are going to work the land. Now, as this declines, people move to urban areas or cities, and we see the rise of the merchant class, individuals that are the first in this burgeoning European capitalist system. And nowhere is more prevalent with this new system than Florence. Florence is a republic, thus of course it is not ruled by a duke or a marquis or the pope, for instance, as the papal states. Instead it's a commune, right, a commune ruled by democratic leaders. So Florence is going to be the site for many of the amazing advances we find in the Renaissance, including careful anatomical dissections later on by Leonardo da Vinci, the powerful moving images by Michelangelo Buonarroti that will eventually make their way to the Sistine Chapel ceiling, and of course the architectural innovations that give rise to perspectival systems by that of Brunelleschi, the architect of the dome seen here to dominate the Florentine skyline. Florence is often referred to as the cradle of the Renaissance, and for good reason. We find that many very important thinkers and artists and scientists are going to find their home in Florence. Everyone from Galileo to Amerigo Vespucci, who gives the Americas their name, this cartographer. And there's a reason why so many come from this small town in Tuscany, and that is competition. So competition and innovation are seen to go hand in hand and drive the Renaissance style forward. And this can also be seen not only in the secular seat of power here at the Piazza della Signoria, right, where you're going to see the Palazzo Vecchio, as it is later known as the Old Palace, once the Medici build a new palace with the Palazzo Pitti, but it can also be seen in Now, the sculptural tradition in Florence is going to give way to the popularity of the painted tradition, thanks to the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. So the Fourth Lateran Council is a gathering of the important ecclesiastical members of the Catholic Church at the beginning of the 13th century, and it is at this meeting that it's decided that transubstantiation is now dogma. It is going to be Catholic writ and law. And we find that it gives way to the demand for a new type of decoration in churches. Transubstantiation as an idea existed going back to the dawn of Christianity, and it was believed that in the Eucharist or communion, that once you ingest the wafer and wine, for instance, during the sacrament, it literally transubstantiated or became the body and blood of Christ. So we find that because this is now happening as a miracle in front of the entire congregation, we need decoration to draw our attention to it. Prior to this time, the decoration that identified where an altar was primarily a crucifix, as we saw in Survey 1, with Coppa di Marcovoldo as the example here, using that Byzantine or maniera greca, right, that Greek manner, with the carefully incised outlines for the figure and the musculature. But this hung, again, 20, 30 feet above altars, not on them, not drawing our attention to them. It is at this time, after 1215, we have the demand to draw our attention to the altar, to witness this miracle that's taking place on it as the priest blesses the sacrament, blesses once again the wafer and the wine for the Eucharist, or communion as Protestants more commonly refer to it. Therefore, we need something to draw our attention to the altar, right? And that is an altarpiece, or a work of art that decorates an altar. These altarpieces can be found now, those that we'll be discussing today, in the Uffizi, Italian for offices, as they were built for Cosimo I as his offices for the Grand Duchy of Tuscany. Now, in the first room, as you walk into the museum, we have a collection of these Trecento altarpieces, very large with gold backgrounds. The preferred format and subject matter at this time is going to be a large, singular wooden panel with a Madonna and Child enthroned on it. The examples of these early altarpieces can be seen here with Cimabue, with the Madonna enthroned with angels and prophets from 1280 to 1290, because we are not exactly sure of the completion date. Now the painting, as we discussed in the introduction, is going to be on panel with tempera. So tempera is going to be that egg-based pigment that gives you a very matte, luminous finish that's great for details, from hair prior to, once again, the different feathers on the angel's wings here. This is a massive painting at 12 feet tall. It's double life size, 7 feet wide in this instance, with the Madonna enthroned in the center of the image with the Christ child on her left knee. She points to him with her right hand as he blesses us with his right hand and 2 fingers, holding in his left hand a scroll or his message. The 8 angels that flank the throne on either side undulate rhythmically as they're going to be gingerly touching or supporting the throne as the Queen of Heaven sits in her sede sapiente, or the throne of wisdom. The background is all gold, indicating that we are actually in heaven. Below, we see 4 aged elderly men that represent the prophets, right? These Old Testament prophets that foretell the coming of Christ, who is literally above them. They literally support the coming of Christ. The style is quite easy to identify as that of the Maniera Greca, which became known in Italy as this Byzantine manner, or Greek manner, literally is what the term means. And that is because it's modeled after those icons that Greek refugees are bringing with them while they're fleeing Constantinople and the eastern set of the empire, the Byzantine Empire. Now this is going to be the first artist, Cimabue is, to be mentioned in Giorgio Vasari's Lives of the Artists, as he begins the Renaissance tradition. So we call this Proto-Renaissance. It is going to have many of the interests contained within it that will drive the Renaissance forward, right? The rebirth of Greco-Roman ideals. His pupil Giotto, we will see, will continue this tradition. The work here by Cimabue, who's otherwise known as the ox head, or the oxen head, because he's going to be either very stubborn or very ugly. This is very common for Italians. They love nicknames. So as we can see, works like this are based very closely on these Byzantine icons brought by these Greek refugees from the East, where we find the Madonna is going to be dressed in a red and blue dress and cloak. The Madonna always wears blue because it is the most expensive color at the time. We find that the Christ child, as a small man dressed as a Roman philosopher type from late antiquity, is going to be seated on her left knee. Remember that the right hand is the righteous hand, therefore it is the one that the Virgin Mary in the Hodegetria pose is pointing to the Christ child, showing the way to salvation, because that's what the Hodegetria means, the way shower pose. Whereas Christ is going to be blessing us with his right hand, holding up the 2 fingers that become the blessing of benediction, modified from the oratorical gesture of adlocutio from the Romans and orators. So surrounding the Madonna and Child enthroned in this massive, elaborate golden throne, we're going to have angels in each example here. The difference, of course, between the prototype of the Byzantine example and that of Cimabue's is that it departs slightly from the flat, hieratic, and flattened spatial compression that we see in the Byzantine example to your left. For instance, exactly where are the angels dressed in ecclesiastical vestments holding a globe with a cross inscribed on it behind her? Where exactly are they in relationship to the throne on which she and the Christ child sit? Now, if you look at Cimabue's, we can tell that the angels are going to be very carefully overlapping one another and are touching the throne at various stages of the construction here. So, therefore, we know where they are, and this is fundamentally what makes the Renaissance example. Now, as people want to know, there are 9 hierarchies of angels, just like there are 9 levels of hell and 9 levels of heaven. They mirror one another. The angels that you often see in art are one of 2 varieties that do not necessarily follow canonical established tradition. So you find that those angels that are closest to God, the seraphim, are going to be bodiless angels, right, with just a head and 6 wings. You find that cherubim seraphim are the next down. These are going to sing in a ring closest to God. The further down we go to the lower hierarchy, you have angels that have human bodies and that appear here on earth and engage with humans. So these are the most common type that you hear about in the Bible that look like men. These appear in the Old Testament primarily, but a few times in the New Testament. So really what we're going to find in the Proto-Renaissance are going to be seraphim and then angels, those that look just like humans with wings. Now, obviously, we see the influence of the International Gothic style here with Cimabue, as the drapery cascades rhythmically down the Virgin Mary's lap, right? Back and forth, as it does with the Virgin Mary here and the Visitation at Reims. Right, so this rhythmic back and forth can also be seen in the serpentine-like snake quality of the angels that undulate gracefully back and forth. So this tells us that Cimabue is indebted to this courtly aristocratic tradition that is going to value these graceful rhythmic turns and sweeping motions. Now, despite the influence of the Byzantine, or Maniera Greca, and the International Gothic style, which is French, you have something that is uniquely Tuscan that is also located here, as we talked about earlier on with Pisano and his Pisa pulpit, and that's going to be an interest in volumetric space and the bulk of figures, the geometry of scenes. So you'll notice that the throne itself is going to be set back behind the picture plane gradually and progressively, showing us that we stair-step backwards, that there is space behind the surface of this painting, and that we can measure this surface, and of course the space beyond it. This interest in volume is going to be carried on by Cimabue's greatest pupil, and that's Giotto di Bondone. So Giotto, in the example we use here with the Ognissanti Madonna, or All Saints Madonna, because we have several saints surrounding the Madonna and Child enthroned, is going to find that he moves this interest, or takes this interest in spatial construction and volume even further, establishing a very clear direction for the Renaissance that will follow him, beginning in the 15th. If we compare the two here, we see that Giotto maintains the prototype, the format and subject matter, which is an enthroned Madonna and Child. Especially, we can see this in the fact that the Christ Child, still dressed in red, is on the left knee of the Madonna. She is still dressed in blue, the most expensive pigment you can buy at the time, which ounce per ounce is the same price as gold. We find that surrounding them, we also have figures flanking either side. However, there is a major difference here with Giotto as he takes this interest in volume and spatial construction even further, because you'll notice that the figures more appropriately overlap one another, not on a ground plane that seems to be tilted upward as in Cimabue, but perpendicular to the picture plane seen here in Giotto, as they're going to be standing on a more level ground as we put it. Even if we look at the figures closely, you can see the increased interest in volumetric solidity, in, once again, the weight and girth, the bulk of the figures, as he very carefully transitions from bright highlights on the brow and cheekbone and nose, with the traditional almond-shaped eyes of the Virgin Mary, to very deep shadows, very gently and very carefully. Thus, this builds up this notion of very heavy, bulky, weighty forms, as you see here in the Christ Child's head. Trying to suggest something is going to be spherical or circular, you have to be very careful with the highlights, building them up, and then transitioning very carefully to deep shadows at the sides. So this interest in volume is going to be coupled with a new approach to naturalism and narrative in the best surviving cycle that we have from the Trecento or 1300s. is going to be found in Padua, which is a city in the Veneto, or the area controlled by the Republic of Venice, just on the mainland, and you can get to it today by train that is going to be leading into Venice. That's one of the stops if you want to see this amazing cycle. And that is going to be the Arena Chapel, as it was commonly known, now more specifically known as the Scrovegni Chapel, named after the patron that paid for it. It's a private chapel attached to a palace, a private residence, that was commissioned by the most wealthy man in all of Padua at the time, Enrico Scrovegni. Enrico Scrovegni is going to have become the most wealthy man in the area through usury, which is, of course, going to be the lending of money for interest. His father, Reginaldo Scrovegni, is very famous as he is the only usurer in hell named by Dante, who speaks. Therefore, he has a reputation already for having been damned to hell. So he needs to do something to ensure his salvation is going to be guaranteed. And that is using his connections to the papacy, that he is the papal banker, or the Pope's banker. So the Pope comes to this chapel in 1305 and consecrates it with a plenary entrance. The interior of the chapel is going to be barrel vaulted, painted on the ceiling with a blue sky with golden stars, the same way the Sistine Chapel was painted before Michelangelo was hired by Julius II to paint over it. The images along the walls, flanking one another, are of the life of the Virgin and the life of Christ, spiraling downward. The paintings themselves are buon fresco, as we discussed, or true fresco, that being they're painted with wet lime plaster on the wall, where you add a Cimabue drawing and then your final giornata in an intonaco layer, the water-based paint on the damp fresco, which absorbs into the wall as it dries, thus making it incredibly durable and long-lasting because it is part of the wall. The Last Judgment, of course, is the centerpiece around the narrative scenes that Giotto is most famous for, and that will be returned to over and over again by later Renaissance artists as a model for narratives and how to actually approach narratives and communicate stories very clearly and powerfully. Now, in Survey 1, we discussed the master of the cycle of Assisi at the Church of Assisi, where we thought that Giotto was actually the author of these paintings earlier on until the 1970s. The reason for that is Tuscan artists appreciate this type of naturalism, this anecdotal detail that allows us to engage with the figures empathetically because they inhabit the same space, wear the same clothes, and react the same way that we would. In The Miracle of the Crib of Greccio, we're going to see this miracle set in a very secular and a very recognizable setting. Right, so this interest is going to be carried on by Giotto in the same way, paving the way for the Renaissance and inventions such as linear perspective, atmospheric perspective, and then obviously anatomical correctness. In his Lamentation, as part of the cycle of the life of Christ, we have the episode that directly follows the crucifixion, where Christ is taken off the cross and lamented, that being those at the crucifixion who prepare him for burial, cry and express their grief at his death. So in the approach here, Giotto, however, introduces new themes and ways of understanding storytelling. And that is, number one, through anchoring it in naturalism, that being how light consistently falls on objects and casts shadows with these bulky, weighty figures, that we understand where they are on this shallow stage-like space in relationship to one another, right? So that being the ones closest to us with their backs turned are going to give us a starting point behind the picture plane to those that are the furthest away from us. The gestures the figures make very clearly are going to tell us how they feel and how we should feel about this particular scene and scenario. And that is these affetti or affectations are going to record these rhetorical gestures, such as that expressed by St. John the Evangelist here, who is shaven and wearing a reddish cloak. He is the surviving John at the crucifixion. You also will have the Virgin Mary dressed in blue, who's now cradling her dead son in her lap. And you often will have the Mary Magdalene here with her red hair as she washed his feet previously, and then Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, those that help move his body, prepare him for burial, and that pay for his tomb. These figures are going to exhibit the rhetorical signs of sadness, that being their brows furrow, their lips quiver, and they are going to have creased eyes, all the indicators of sadness that we often see on a stage or that actors would perform, that clearly externalizes what they're feeling internally. This, of course, is not realistic. We find that the Italians will not show, and Giotto certainly does not show, the physical effects of sadness, which are going to be, say, tears, blotchiness of the face, right? So the liquid escaping the face, because that, of course, is not going to be aesthetically pleasing, which they want. Now, Giotto, in his approach to storytelling, right, or narrative painting, is going to ensure that nothing is superfluous. Nothing in the work is going to be there that does not help us understand the main point of the narrative. So the composition will always support the narrative action. In this instance, if you look carefully, you will notice that the background, including this craggy, rocky outcropping, is going to move diagonally down through St. John the Evangelist with his arms outstretched very dramatically to the Virgin's head, straight to Christ's head, which is being cradled by the figure in the bottom left. There is no way to escape the focal point of this image, which is, of course, Christ, and lamenting him. To ensure that all of the figures react emotionally, they also are going to be designed or composed in an elliptical fashion. So all of them look towards Christ. All of them direct their attention and their gaze and their emotional intensity towards Christ. Even the angels above are going to be foreshortened and dive bomb, wringing their hands, having once again their hands pressed to their cheeks, all of which express deep grief coming from the Mediterranean tradition back to the ancient Greeks that we see on Gray's paintings, such as the geometric funeral crater that we covered in Survey 1. Now, if we turn to the south of the Republic of Florence, we have the Republic of Siena, their main rival at this time in the Trecento, that being the population and the mercantile activity rivaled that of Florence and Siena, and so they're going to have begun a cathedral and decorated it in a way that would rival that of the Florentines. It is here in the piazza, which every Italian city has, a major central public square, just like the Piazza della Signoria we looked at in Florence. You have a famous horse race that still takes place to this day. So every summer, each neighborhood is going to have a jockey and a horse in this bareback palio race, whereby each neighborhood will compete for dominance and bragging rights the next year. So this is still a tradition that has continued from the later Middle Ages till today. It is in this that we have the backdrop to the creation of a very important work that the Sienese still value to this day, and that's going to be the Maestà. The story leading to the creation of the Maestà is very interesting. The story relates to how the Virgin Mary became the primary patron saint of Siena. And, as many of these stories are going to communicate, it is divine intervention or a miracle that leads to the creation of a work of art. So during the Battle of Monteperti, the night before, or the eve of battle, in 1260, the general on the Sienese side makes his way to the altarpiece, or an antependium, in the cathedral, as you see here, and prays directly to the Virgin Mary asking her for her help in the upcoming battle. The battle is going to be between the Florentines, who are going to be the political faction known as the Guelphs, that back the papacy or the Pope. They have 35,000 soldiers. The Sienese are going to back the Holy Roman Emperor. They are Ghibellines. They have 15,000 less. Only 20,000 soldiers in the upcoming battle, so it would take a miracle for them to win. Here is the image that the general on the Sienese side prayed to, the Madonna degli Occhi Grossi, or the Madonna of the Large Eyes. This is an antependium showing you what the decoration looked like prior to the creation of the Maestà we will discuss. That is a decoration on the front of the altar. An antependium, literally ante is before, and pendium comes from pendere, which is going to be to hang. So it hangs before the altar. So this image is what the general was looking at as he beseeched the Virgin Mary to help them in the upcoming battle. The Virgin Mary granted the victory to the Sienese, and true to his word, the general is going to commission an altarpiece that would be paraded through the city, as we still see happening today in many areas in Europe, towards the cathedral, thus announcing the new patron saint of Siena and the new superiority and patronage of the Virgin Mary. So just like we have today, altarpieces will be carried around a city to consecrate every neighborhood and to celebrate different traditions, right? In this case, the installation of a very expensive and a very appreciated piece, that of the Maestà, or the Madonna and Child in Majesty, otherwise known as the Madonna and Child enthroned with saints. This massive central panel shows you what the front of the image looked like at 13 feet wide, 7 feet tall, so over life-size figures. We have the Madonna and Child in the center, enthroned on a throne that looks much like the cathedral in which we are now standing. And then you have the four main previous patron saints kneeling below her, showing their subservience to the new patron saint of Siena. Then, above them, you have the holy elect, the various saints, right, who have died throughout history, including St. John the Baptist, including, once again, St. Paul, right, and these various other martyrs. Above them, you're going to find angels are going to flank the throne, just like Cimabue's earlier. Now, the Italians invent this new type of image, which is called a Sacra Conversazione, that was commissioned by the Opera del Duomo in 1308, the works of the cathedral that we discussed, also patronizing Andrea Pisano, right, and his 28 quatrefoil panels of the life of St. John the Baptist. But the Italians invent a new type of painting, which is known as a holy conversation, or a sacred conversation, whereby holy figures from different historical and chronological eras, because they all lived and died at different times, are miraculously brought together to converse, right, to talk amongst one another. Thus we can kneel and pray before them, and all of them can hear us simultaneously and can intercede on our behalf simultaneously. So it is a critical mass of holiness, if you will, that is able to help us, right, and by extension help the city of. Now, the tradition of the Madonna and Child enthroned is going to be a Byzantine one, being brought over by those Greek refugees that we discussed. But it is not seen really in the chrysography and the linearity in Duccio's example. His is much more rhythmic, much more elegant and soft as far as the modeling is concerned, because he's not replicating the Byzantines. He's more influenced by the International Gothic style, as we'll see on the back of this massive altar. So the 14th century, or the 1300s in Italy, is going to see many important developments that will lead to the Renaissance. That being, we have the development of panel paintings, that being painting on one solid surface from icons brought by Greek refugees. We see the emergence of narrative art, or again, stories that are going to be generally related to the life of Christ or the Virgin Mary or saints. Then we have the renewed interest in naturalism, looking looking at how light actually falls. Shadows are cast, how figures are going to be located in space in front of and behind one another. And then finally, we see the slow shedding of and movement away from the Byzantine and Gothic styles. Those styles that are going to either distort anatomy, create something that focuses on graceful linearity, but otherwise move us away from the appearance of figures in nature. This lecture will cover the 14th century, or 1300s, in France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire, now known as Germany, Switzerland, and Austria. Following upon the 1300s in Italy, we find that these three various regions continue the development and interest from the later France, which we will begin with by discussing the development of this country that becomes the arbiter of taste in the Gothic style as we've been discussing it. Just want to point out the map of the later Middle Ages, whereby the Holy Roman Empire, or Germany, controls much of the area that is now Austria, northern Italy, Switzerland, and then areas in Eastern Europe. There is no Spain as of yet, because the Christian kingdoms are still battling the Muslims or the Umayyad Caliphate in the south, which they will not fully reclaim until 1492. And England, of course, controls the eastern section of Ireland as today, and the southern areas up until we get to Scotland. Now, France is going to become the arbiter of taste, or the taste maker, creating this interest in the international Gothic style, and then exporting it to these various countries, including England, Germany. Now, Gothic, it should be known, is actually a misnomer. Goth, of course, referring to German tribes, especially those at the end of the Roman Empire that sacked it, such as the Visigoths under the rule of King Alaric. Giorgio Vasari, who wrote the Lives of the Artist, would identify and accuse this Germanic barbarous style of distorting the purity of the classical tradition that he was trying to revive. In actuality, the Gothic style is more properly known as opus Franciginum, that being French work, and this international Gothic style, which would last from 1140 until 1400, reflects the ideals of the court seen in France and espoused by the French monarchy. Now, the time period in which we will be discussing is going to be that of the 100 Years' War that lasted from 1337 until 1453. This war, fought primarily in northern France, between England and France, ravaged the countryside and forced the monarchy to spend the majority of its funds on war. This left little by way of patronage for the arts, thus leaving open more private patrons to begin commissioning work, such as the Dukes of Burgundy we will discuss. Now, this is also the same period in which you have Joan of Arc hearing voices that command her to kick the English out of France, which she successfully does, even though she's burned at the stake for it after the war. At this time, we find Charles IV, who's going to be commissioning a very wealthy luxury item in the sumptuary arts for his 14-year-old queen, Jeanne d'Evreux. So the notion of marrying at 13 or 14 was actually quite common at the time upon the onset of menses. This, of course, ensured that there were no issues or arguments for the right of succession had the queen been engaged in relationships prior to her marriage. Now, the imagery that we find in the Book of Hours, which is a manuscript illumination for Jeanne d'Evreux, clearly states that her primary goal is the style of the International Gothic seen in this Book of Hours is very courtly and fashionable of the day, and is also not entirely religious. Books of Hours are private prayer books, which are going to illustrate the 8 canonical devotional hours of the day and would be carried or worn like jewelry, much as you would carry a clutch on the red carpet today or a wonderfully jewel-encrusted handbag. Now, the Book of Hours is named as such because each hour of the day, this ecclesiastical hour, you would say a different prayer from morning until evening. In the example shown here, Jean Pucelle, who is the most accomplished manuscript illuminator in France, is going to decorate each page with an image of the life of Christ, paralleling that of the life of the Virgin. Now, this type of typology, paralleling one story with the other, that of the Virgin Mary and her son, is very common. We saw this with Giotto's Scribani Chapel, for instance. Now, the particular moments chosen to parallel are also significant and generally are going to fall in line with the narrative or arc of their lives from birth until death, or from beginning until end. So as we have here, the betrayal of Judas, or the kiss of Judas on the left-hand side, where we find Judas is leaning in to identify Christ to be arrested by the Romans. You find Peter is still cutting off the ear of the servant right directly below him, is going to be paralleled with that of the Annunciation, where you find the Archangel Gabriel is going to be kneeling in front of the Virgin Mary, telling her that she will give birth to the Son of God, while a section of the ceiling opens up, allowing the dove of the Holy Spirit to descend on her and impregnate her. Now, each one of these scenes is going to relate to the beginning of something. The betrayal of Judas relates to the beginning of Christ's passion, whereas the Annunciation scene is the beginning of Christ's incarnation, when he becomes flesh. Now, the body of Christ and that of the Virgin Mary are likewise in a parallel fashion facing one another and are S-shaped. The Virgin Mary is a backwards S to complement that of Christ. This elegant, elongated style reflects that of the courtly style we discussed earlier, each one here painted in grisaille or shades of gray instead of being entirely in color, which would be incredible. Now, the small, doll-like architecture, right, and the elegance of the figures means that Pucelle certainly would have traveled to Siena to look at the art of Duccio that we talked about, who had decorated the Maestà, and similarly attempted to set within the small architectural features these elongated, very elegant forms. Jean Devreux also, along with having Jean Pucelle decorate a Book of Hours for her, also patronized a wonderful reliquary for herself that she dedicated and gave to the Church of Saint-Denis, the burial place for the French monarchs. Now, in the International Gothic style, we have a very characteristic, elegant, elongated figure here of the Virgin Mary, holding a fleur-de-lis in her right hand, which of course is the lily flower, with the Christ child, right? Here we have the lily flower encrusted with pearls and semi-precious stones, whereas the Christ child is going to be gently touching her face with his right hand, holding an apple in his left. Now, the fleur-de-lis is the symbol of the French monarchy, going all the way back to the Merovingians and then adopted again by Charlemagne in his imagery. Now, this is a reliquary, which means that it holds a relic, which is going to be an object associated with a holy person. It can either be part of their body or something they touched, such as the crown of thorns or the shroud of Turin or Veronica's veil are all going to be relics of Christ because they touched him at the crucifixion and during the Passion. In this case, we find a strand of Mary's hair is actually going to be inside of this section of the reliquary. Now, you find that Christ is going to be holding an apple, and even though it does not explicitly state that the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil was an apple, the fruit here directly connects Christ as the new Adam, and thus the virgin as the new Eve. Since Adam and Eve caused the downfall of mankind, it is thus appropriate and apropos that the virgin and Christ will redeem mankind. This is the type of typology that we find that is very common in the Christian tradition, including that of the Old Testament prophets below that are going to be flanking scenes from the Passion itself. Thus we have a type of paralleling here of the Old Testament that foretells the New Testament. And very common that you've already seen with Cimabue's Madonna and Child Enthroned with Prophets and Angels. All right, so at the same time, we have the prophets, right, foretelling and supporting the Virgin Mary in the coming of Christ. Now, this style that can be seen here with the Virgin of Jean d'Oeuvres is a textbook International Gothic, in that we have a swaying S-shaped pose, a very exaggerated pose with all of the weight placed on one leg. In this case, she's shifting all of her weight to the left, thus relaxing the right leg and the hips moving in the opposite direction, giving you that characteristic elegant, sensuous S shape. The drapery as well is going to be pulled back and forth across the figure, thus rhythmically acting as a rhythmic device, showing you that the figure is, as at court, appropriately elegant. So the International Gothic style, if we were to consider the characteristics, are as follows. You will have these elongated proportions, slightly attenuated, we would say. We have very heavy drapery that does not act as though gravity is pulling or drawing it downward, but instead sweeping and swaying side to side as though it were alive in a character of its own. And then finally, serpentine rhythmic lines and motions that move us back and forth across the figure, that sways from one direction to the next. A very appropriately elegant and kingly style. England at the same time, which of course controlled much of the United Kingdom that we know today, sans Western Ireland and Scotland, and is also going to control southern Italy and Sicily, is going to prosper at this time, given that most of the wars fought in the 100 Years' War, these battles, occurred on the northern coast of France, and thus spared England and its inhabitants the suffering that this caused. It's at this time that we have Chaucer writing the Canterbury Tales on secular stories that come out of and after the Black Death. We also are going to find at this time that the rise of the individual, an interest in humanism in Italy with poets such as Dante and Petrarch, these historians that are reviving and trying to translate ancient Greco-Roman manuscripts and literature themselves. At the same time, we have the rise of secular art and an interest in secularism that we also learned. In works such as the small ivory chest with scenes of courtly romances, produced between 1330 and 1350, we have an example of a luxury object or sumptuary art that would be given to a woman to hold her jewelry. It's also going to often be used as a courtship or a wedding gift, something you would give to a woman as part of the courtship ritual of trying to woo her and or as a gift on her wedding. So the scenes, appropriately, are not religious. They are secular and often are going to relate scenes of love in allegorical or metaphorical. So here we have on the top of this jewelry box the attack on the Castle of Love. So the attack on the Castle of Love will have episodes that people would be familiar with at the time, such as jousting tournaments and battles, besieging cities, etc. In the center, we have two knights who are charging at one another with their lances outstretched, as, of course, women above look on and point and consider the bravery of these men. Now, the act of jousting is, of course, a metaphor for courtship itself, which we can see to the right, in which a woman is mock jousting with a knight, as each holds a rose and then an oak bough. Now, symbolism of these objects will reveal that they are sexual surrender and fertility. Thus, of course, the game of charging at one another, as almost as though we're playing a game of chicken, seeing who will flinch, is to have the outcome of fertility, to get married, to have children. So we have that symbolism here. In the rose, always a symbol of love and courtship, and the oak bough, oaks and acorns, of course, relating to the male seed and fertility. On the left-hand side, we have a series of knights that are besieging a city, where at the top we find Cupid with an oversized, comically oversized, bow and arrow firing back, and others defending the territory. Now remember that a woman's chastity and her virtue are seen as a castle wall, which men must besiege and conquer and break down. Thus you see them climbing up the wall, trying to get over it, just as you would then conquer a woman's virtue and then courtship would be consummated. This can also be seen as far as scenes of love and courtship and the power that women hold over men in the side where we find the follies of Aristotle, the great philosopher, pupil of Plato, and mentor and teacher of Alexander the Great. So we find here again Alexander the Great mentoring, great pupils like, find Aristotle mentoring great pupils like Alexander the Great, showing us what a great thinker he was. Yet even this amazing thinker, philosopher, and founder of the Aristotelian and Peripatetic tradition cannot overcome his desire for Campase, which is going to be the mistress of Alexander the Great. So he is so smitten by this woman that he is going to demean himself by acting like an animal, playing horseyback with her, letting her ride him like an animal in this instance, with, of course, a bridle in his mouth. So this is meant to represent the folly of the pagan philosopher, but also how women have power over their suitors, an appropriate subject, given that the beauty of a woman, which is going to be emphasized by the jewelry that she wears, would be kept within this object. Now, on the end, we have another very interesting image that relates to the virtue and power of women, that of Tristan and Isolde, and that of a unicorn. So off to the left, you can see the duped king whose soon-to-be wife is actually cheating on him, falling in love with Tristan here. It's a very famous story that leads to the Arthurian legend of Arthur and Guinevere. But off to the right, aside from this cuckolded husband, you're going to see a man who is stabbing a unicorn that sits in a woman's lap, more specifically a virgin's lap that you have here. The long, oversized horn can be seen sprouting out of its brow. Now, you find that virgins are going to be associated with unicorns in imagery, especially in the north, in tapestries, paintings, and engravings like what we see here, these relief carvings, because it was understood that virgins and chastity were as rare as a unicorn, and thus they're the only ones that can get close to, given their purity, a unicorn. Now, imagery can be found throughout the marginalia of illuminated manuscripts and the art at this time, whereby the unicorn always sits in the virgin's lap and is penetrated by a knight who comes in with a spear. The unicorn has a phallic object coming out of its head, and the knight is also going to have a phallic object to conquer it. So it is, of course, very obvious that the man is going to be killing the woman's virginity. Thus, of course, her purity, which is the unicorn, symbolized as such, is killed. And Louis. Now in Germany, the Holy Roman Empire is still going to exist, having been founded by the first Holy Roman Emperor Charlemagne in 800 Common Era. So the Holy Roman Empire still exists as a loose conglomeration of principalities and states, ruled separately by dukes, right, and these little duchies, with a figurehead, much like the Queen of England, named the Holy Roman Emperor, overseeing them. So this is no longer going to represent a significant power in Europe at this time, but the traditions still do continue. Right, so just to show you an image of the various principalities that make up Germany today in these various counties, such as Bavaria, for instance, or Prussia, Pomerania, right, in the northern section here. So all of these are going to loosely be affiliated and speak German, and they will pledge loyalty to the Holy Roman Emperor, but they fight one another. So it's at this time that they lose control over Italy, they lose control over Sicily to England, and we see the decline in German power. Now, the emperors, again, only have nominal authority over these independent principalities, and this is further fragmented by the events of the latter half. Now, to review Germanic art seen in the Holy Roman Empire, as that we reviewed in the first survey, seen with St. Maurice and Eckhart and Uta, is going to reveal a type of naturalism and psychological insight and realism that is lacking anywhere else in Europe. Because they are in the north, and because they are distant from the Greco-Roman classical tradition, they do not base their sculptures on those seen in the classical world, such as ancient Greece and Rome. Instead, they adopted the figures as they appeared, making portraits of living individuals with anecdotal details included. Right, so they're polychrome to look as naturalistic as possible, and they include ethnographic specifics such as racial markers, for instance. This is what the Germans are interested in. Now, in the latter half of the 14th century, we have many current events that further drive this interest in psychological realism and naturalism even further. And those can be seen especially to relate to the Black Death of 1348. So the Black Death, otherwise known as the bubonic plague, is going to have spread from the steppes of Asia to the port city of Kaffa, down through Constantinople and then Italy. Then it spread throughout all of Western Europe, killing in some instant of the population, and at least in many cities, a third of the population of all of Europe have died. This, of course, we do not have exact numbers for, because those individuals charged with census data also perished. So it's widespread epidemiological disaster. Of course, they did not know that the Black Death was spread by fleas who hitched a ride on the back of rats, carrying, again, the bacterium Yersinia pestis, which, of course, caused the slow deterioration of the systems in the body, which shut down periodically. You find that there would be a putrid stench that would emanate from the figures as their body slowly rotted. So plague doctors would often wear what would be the equivalent, as we would understand today, as gas masks with the CDC. Thus, they would wear bird beaks, so they would not get sick from the stench of victims. So it is called the bubonic plague, however, because of the buboes that will form. These are going to be large protrusions around the lymph nodes of the neck, the groin, and the armpit. So they very often would lance these very painful protrusions with the liquids coming out of them. You can see in the top left the lancing of a woman's neck, whereas the armpit is ready to be lanced and the liquid seeping out to the left here. It's called the Black Death because of gangrene that sets in, this necrotizing effect, this necrosis, whereby dead blood will pool right to the surface, thus your skin turns black. This horrific series of events that left millions dead in Europe had a particular effect in Germany that appreciated and prized naturalism and psychological realism. So this is why, thanks to these plagues and widespread famine, that we have the development of Andachtsbilder. Andachtsbilder are going to be devotional images dedicated to the early or the last hours of Christ's life, usually corresponding with the prayers one would say at different times of the day. Now, this is going to be appropriately and specifically German in that we do not see anything akin to an Andachtsbilder in any other country in this period. So you find the Germans are going to focus on this brutal realism that's trying to communicate empathetically the suffering and death that time. So this gives rise to a certain type of Andachtsbilder. Bild is an image, for instance, in German, and that's going to be the Vesper build. So Vespers is going to be a prayer that you say in the evening that recalls Christ's death. So here we find with the Virgin and Dead Christ, with the Röntgenpietà, a great example of this type of specific Andachtsbilder, the Vesper build, whereby we have a lamentation type with the Virgin Mary seated on an altar with the dead Christ on her lap. She is going to be wearing not her usual blue cloak, but instead a cope, an ecclesiastical vestment, right, that priests wear, that bishops wear at the time, which of course are going to represent the altar on which Christ's body will come back for the Eucharist. But this image is going to be 34 inches high, so once again just under 3 feet, and is not the massive sculptural ensemble you're used to seeing in later periods. So if we look at a detail of the Virgin Mary and Christ, you can see that the image is polychromed or painted in many colors to make it as realistic as possible, from the flesh of her face, the rosy cheeks, the red lips, to the blood pouring out of the grotesque wound. Right, so this looks like an altar because you find it's appropriate, as this is an altar piece sitting on an altar, but we are equating the tomb with the throne here. Now, priests are going to pray over the Eucharist, as you see here. Thus, Christ's body comes back, which was sacrificed for Christian salvation. So they are literally viewing the transubstantiation here as they will consume the body of Christ. And you see this is a lamentation type, right, where the Virgin Mary is lamenting her dead child that's going to be curled in her lap. The antitype of the enthroned Madonna and child as we know it. But again, with the Italians, they appreciate idealism. This is rhetorical sadness, as we discussed with these affetti. For the Germans, they appreciate the brutal realism of what it would look like if a body had been crucified and broken, with the nails inserted into the hands and feet, a spear thrust into his side, a crown of thorns lacerating his forehead with blood trickling down. They are not, of course, in any way overlooking the horrific suffering associated with this type of sacrifice. And what do we see but a reflection of what is happening around them every day? They can see the suffering out in the streets with bodies that are strewn about. So many bodies, people could not even bury them. They couldn't even haul them off. So they would put them in piles and burn them, right? So they're seeing this type. Now, the devotional object, which is interesting here, foretells the function of the icon in the Byzantine tradition, in which you pray directly to the Madonna and child. In this instance, we pray directly to the Madonna, so she will intercede on our behalf in the Last Judgment. But it is a personal, private contemplation. Thus, this foretells the schism that will lead to the Reformation. In Germany, the home of the Reformation and Martin Luther, that separates from the Catholic Church, demands a personal relationship and understanding of the Bible and of the holy figures. So this merely foretells that particular approach to worship and religion. Regardless, what we find happening in the 14th century in the Black Death is a rise in secular art, that being imagery that is not religious, that does not show images from the Bible, but instead from the everyday. We find the expansion of the International Gothic into all regions of Western and Eastern Europe and the regional variations of them. In England, they are going to adopt the International Gothic, and they are going to ensure that it is even more decorative. In Germany, they appreciate brutal naturalism and realism as it reflects the events surrounding them and their native interest in naturalism and psychological realism. In Italy, they of course also retreat and revert back to the older Gothic style, right, with examples such as the Strozzi altarpiece. Right, so this retreat from naturalism will last a generation in Italy from 1348 to 1400 until we see the rise of